Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on something pretty big. Canada's immigration system.
Yeah, seems like things are changing.
Definitely. And we're basing this deep dive on an article we found super interesting from the Economic Times.
Yeah.
It's called, get this, Millions of Immigrants Might Have to Leave Canada Next Year.
Catchy title.
Right. And really got us thinking. So the article highlights this pretty wild fact. Apparently, something like almost 5 million temporary permits are set to expire in Canada
Mm.
by the end of 2025.
Wow, 5 million. That's like, if you think about it, that's like the entire population of New Zealand.
Yeah. And they're all, like, potentially in this uncertain situation.
Potentially.
Like, what happens to them? Do they all have to leave?
Well, that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's especially interesting because, Canada has this reputation of being pretty open to immigration
Yeah.
historically. Right.
Yeah, generally.
So this seems like a pretty big
It's
shift.
definitely a shift.
So what kinds of permits are we even talking about here? Is this like every immigrant in Canada?
Well, no, it's not everybody. And that's a really important point. It's not one big group. You got to break it down. So the article mentions, for example, there are like 766,000 study permits, just study permits,
Yeah.
set to expire by December 2025.
So like hundreds of thousands of students.
Yeah. Potentially having to leave right when they're finishing their degrees.
Yeah.
But it's not just students. It's also, we're talking about work permits, right?
Right.
For temporary foreign workers. And those are spread across like a whole bunch of different industries.
So we've got these students who might get sent home and businesses that might suddenly lose workers. Like what's going on? What's the reason for this huge change?
Well, the Trudeau government is kind of framing this as like a necessary step
Right.
to balance things out. They're
Yeah.
saying, look, we need to balance economic needs with, our infrastructure capacity.
Yeah.
They're saying, hey, rapid population growth has put a strain on housing, healthcare, social services, all that.
Yeah.
And they're not just talking, they're also like taking action. They've set these new immigration targets, which represent, get this, a 21% decrease in permanent residents.
Wow. 21%.
Yeah, down from 500,000 to 395,000 in 2025.
So that's for permanent residents.
Mhm.
But what about all those temporary folks, like all those millions with expiring permits? Is the government just expecting all of them to leave?
Well, the article actually quotes Canada's immigration minister, Mark Miller, and he says he expects most people to leave voluntarily when their permits run out.
Okay.
But I also mentions that the Canadian Border Services Agency, the CBSA, they will be enforcing, the laws against anyone who overstays.
It's kind of like a mixed message.
Kinda, yeah. Like they're saying, please leave, but also we'll kick you out if you don't.
So a lot of people must be feeling really uncertain right now.
Yeah.
Not sure what they should do.
Oh, absolutely. And the article doesn't even really get into the human side of this, the emotional toll. Like, we're talking families being separated, dreams being shattered, lives uprooted. That's heavy stuff. And then there are also the economic consequences to consider.
Right.
Canada really relies on temporary foreign workers in a lot of sectors. Think agriculture, healthcare, hospitality. What happens if those workers are suddenly gone?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the article does touch on that. Like they talk about how businesses are already struggling to find workers and how these cuts could make everything way worse.
Absolutely.
Like we could see labor shortages, rising wages, maybe even slower economic growth overall.
Yeah. It's complicated, and the article doesn't shy away from, like, the political side of all this either. They point out that this is happening, as Trudeau's government is facing a lot of pressure with the elections coming up.
So could this be a way to try and win over voters who might be worried about immigration?
I mean, it's definitely possible. Immigration is always, like, a hot button issue. And if the government wants to appeal to people who are worried about, immigration happening too fast or putting a strain on resources, well, this is one way to do it.
It's interesting, right? You've got economics, social worries, political maneuvering, all kind of swirling around this one issue.
Yeah, definitely.
But before we get too deep into the politics, I want to go back to something you said earlier about those different types of permits.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You mentioned study permits, work permits, but there are other categories, right? Under temporary residency in Canada.
Oh, there are tons. Like, there are temporary resident visas for people just visiting, tourists.
Great.
And then there are visas for business people, people coming for medical treatment. There are also permits for people in cultural exchange programs, working holidays, even some for people seeking asylum.
So it's not just one group. It's all kinds of people.
Yeah, tons of different reasons for being in Canada, and now they're all dealing with this uncertainty about what happens next.
And it's more than just whether they get to stay or not. It's their whole lives, right? Their
Yeah.
families, their plans for the future.
Exactly. It's like imagine you're a student, you've spent, I don't know, 4 years here studying, working hard, you're about to graduate, you're excited to start your career, and then boom, your permit's expiring, you might have to leave.
That's rough.
Totally. And it's not just students. It's families being separated, people worried about getting deported. It's a lot to deal with.
It really makes you think,
Yeah.
about what's fair, what's just. Is it right to uproot people who have made Canada their home? What does a country owe to people who come looking for a better life?
Big questions. And Canadians are really struggling with them right now. There are strong arguments on all sides.
Yeah,
Like some people say temporary residents should have a path to permanent residency, especially if they've put down roots.
makes sense.
Right, but then others say, no, temporary should mean temporary. Canada needs to look out for its own citizens first.
It's tough. It's a real ethical dilemma.
It is. And it's not just Canada dealing with this. Like we said, this whole situation has global implications.
Right. It's kind of a microcosm of what's happening worldwide. Developed nations are all struggling with this. How do you manage immigration? How do you balance economic needs with social concerns?
It's a big one. And there's no one answer. Every country's different, and the decisions they make are going to have huge consequences.
So what does this all mean for Canada? What could happen next? We'll explore that in part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So we left off talking about all these huge potential changes in Canada's immigration system. And honestly, it's kind of overwhelming to think about.
Yeah, it's a lot. And sometimes, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, the policies, but we got to remember, we're talking about real people here, real lives being affected.
Right, exactly. So let's zoom in on that a bit. What could this actually look like on the ground? What are some of the real-world consequences, like for the economy, for example? We talked about labor shortages a bit, but how could those play out in different sectors? Get specific.
Okay, so let's take agriculture, for example. A lot of Canadian farms, they really rely on temporary foreign workers, right, to get those crops harvested. And a lot of them are already struggling to find enough workers as it is. So imagine these cuts happen. We could see a situation where, like, crops are literally rotting in the fields because there's no one to pick them.
Wow.
And what does that mean? Higher food prices for everyone, maybe even shortages of certain foods.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about healthcare? We always hear about long wait times, staffing shortages in hospitals. Could this make all that even worse?
It's definitely a worry. Think about it. A lot of hospitals, long-term care facilities, they rely on temporary foreign workers too. Nurses, personal support workers, all those vital roles. So if we cut immigration, those staffing shortages could get way worse. Even longer wait times for patients, more stress on an already stretched system.
Okay, so we're talking potential problems with food, healthcare, the economy in general. Sounds kind of bleak, honestly. But the government's argument is that, hey, these cuts are necessary, right? To give Canada time to catch up, deal with its infrastructure issues. What are they talking about specifically?
Housing is a big one. The
Yeah.
article really highlights that. Canada, especially those big cities, they have a huge housing shortage. And all that rapid population growth over the past few years, it's only made things worse. Rents are skyrocketing, home prices are crazy. It's tough for people to find a decent place to live.
So their logic is slow down the population growth, give us time to build more affordable housing.
But is that the only way? Are there other things Canada could do?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some experts are saying, look, instead of cutting immigration, why not invest more in actually building affordable housing?
Yeah.
They look at countries like, say, Germany or Sweden. They've managed to integrate a lot of immigrants, but they've also got these strong social safety nets. They make sure people have access to affordable housing. So it's not like an either thing. You could manage immigration and also invest in the support systems that people need.
Right, exactly. It's about finding that balance, and maybe Canada can learn something from these other countries, adapt their approaches. But it takes, being creative, thinking long term.
It also takes money, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these solutions would require a big investment up front.
No doubt. And that might be tough to sell politically, but the payoff could be huge. Think about it. If Canada can really integrate newcomers, support them, help them thrive, The benefits for everyone would be enormous.
And it's not just economic benefits either, right? It's
Yeah.
about creating a more diverse, inclusive society, a stronger Canada.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to something we keep coming back to, the human element. We can't forget that these policies, these decisions, they affect real people's lives. We need to make sure that compassion, fairness, that's at the heart of it all.
It's a lot to consider. It can be tough to really grasp what this means for people on a personal level. Can you paint a picture for our listeners? What could this look like for someone whose permit is expiring?
Okay, imagine this. You're a student. Let's say you came from India to study engineering in Canada. You've been here 4 years, working hard, making sacrifices. You're building a life here. You're about to graduate, super excited to start your career. And then, bam, you get the news. Your permit's expiring. You might have to leave.
Oof.
Everything you've worked for, all those years, all that money, the emotional investment, suddenly it's in jeopardy.
That would be heartbreaking. And it's not just students either, right? Think about families being separated, parents struggling to provide for their kids, people living in fear of deportation. It's a lot.
It is. And we have to remember, even if the government's intention is good, even if they want what's best for everyone, these policies are going to hit some people harder than others.
It makes you think about what kind of country we want to be, right? A welcoming place that offers opportunity, or a place that closes its doors.
Deep stuff. And Canadians are really wrestling with these questions right now. And honestly, the answers are going to shape not just Canada's future, but the future of global migration as a whole.
It's a lot to unpack,
Yeah.
and we've only scratched the surface. In part 3, we'll look at some potential solutions. Hear from experts who are tackling these challenges head on. Stay with us.
And we're back. So we spent a lot of time talking about the problems, the challenges, all the potential downsides of these immigration changes. But what about solutions? What are the alternatives?
Right. Is cutting immigration the only way to go?
Yeah. What else could Canada do?
Well, a lot of experts are saying, look, we need a bigger picture approach, not just focusing on numbers.
Okay. So not just how many people come in, what else?
Well, think about the things we've talked about. The strain on housing, healthcare, social services. Maybe instead of cutting immigration, we should invest more in those areas.
So like build more affordable housing.
Exactly. Expand healthcare capacity. Strengthen those social safety nets. Basically, fix the systems that are struggling instead of just saying fewer people.
Right. It's about getting to the root of the problem. And some people argue that this is actually more sustainable, more humane in the long run. They point to countries like, I don't know, Germany, Sweden. They've taken in a lot of immigrants, but they've also invested in making sure everyone has what they need.
And it's worked out for them.
Well, they've managed to integrate people pretty well. They've maintained a high quality of life. So maybe Canada can learn something from that, maybe adapt some of those approaches.
That's interesting. But those countries are different, right? Different history, different social structures.
Oh, absolutely. And there's no guarantee it would work the same way here. But it's worth looking into,
Right.
being open to new ideas. And it all comes down to, being willing to invest, to think long term.
Yeah. Investment seems key. But a lot of these solutions, they probably cost a lot of money up front. That might be a tough sell politically.
Yeah, that's the reality. You need political will. You need a vision that goes beyond the next election cycle. But the potential rewards are huge. Think about it. If Canada can figure out how to integrate newcomers effectively, support them, everyone benefits.
Right. It's not just about helping immigrants. It's about creating a stronger, more dynamic country for everyone.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to something we've talked about a lot, the human element. We can't forget that we're talking about people's lives here. We need to make sure our policies are based on compassion, on fairness.
It's definitely complex. No easy answers. But okay, let's say our listeners are thinking, this is important, I want to do something. What can they do?
Well, first of all, stay informed. Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one, right? Have conversations. Don't just skim the headlines.
Go deeper.
Right. Really understand the issues. And then don't be afraid to talk to your elected officials. Let them know what you think. Hold them accountable. You can also support organizations that are helping immigrants. There are tons of ways to get involved, big or small.
This has definitely been a lot to process. It feels like Canada's at a real turning point. And the decisions we make now are going to have a lasting impact.
And it's not just Canada, right? It's a global thing all around the world. Countries are facing this. How do we manage immigration? How do we build societies that are inclusive and fair? These are questions that aren't going away anytime soon.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. But as always, we encourage you to keep learning, Keep exploring. This is a conversation that needs to continue.